Hello and welcome to another episode of Unsourced Wall. My name is Elvis, and as always, I'm your host. Now, we actually have a lot of things to talk about this week. First and foremost, we're going to have a few spoiler casts in this episode, specifically regarding Teen Titans Go to the Movies, which I finally saw, and the recently released Deadpool 2 Extended Cut, also known as the Super Duper Cut, and I'll be putting time codes below and reminding everyone. But first, we have a lot of news. Let's get into it. The most astounding being that the James Gunn saga isn't over yet. We've had a few more twists and turns, and each of them has been more hilarious than the next. To top it off, we have Dave Bautista, who, as I mentioned last week, has been on Gunn's side since day one, since this whole thing blew up. He's been going to bat for Gunn day per day, tweet per tweet. So that's been really, really fun. And it reached perhaps an apex this week because not only did Bautista put on social media that he feels that Disney is a nauseating company to work with and that he will only work with them to fulfill his contract, but he went up another notch by then clarifying that if they did not use James Gunn's script, he would quit entirely, no matter the cost to his contract or the repercussions of that, which is insanely amazing. It's insane and it's incredible. Much like James Gunn's own career, where he's not the kind of entity in Hollywood that really relies on big franchise movies to keep him afloat. Dave Bautista, he started off in professional wrestling, and honestly, I think, and I've heard from many fans that he would be welcomed back. He's not the sort of, let's say, on the level of Brock Lesnar, where no one really cared that he left and that no one really cared when he came back. But Bautista has still some cachet in that department they can reliably fall back on. And that's like James Gunn going back to, say, doing B movies. It's not something that is well without his wheelhouse, and it's not something that I don't think he would be reluctant to do it. So I do believe Bautista when he says that he would just outright quit because there is really nothing keeping him there. I just think that entire outburst has been quite fun. The most amazing thing, though, is that apparently there are rumors that Disney has totally acquiesced to this and might actually be considering using James Gunn's original script as the foundation for Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. Although they don't really need to, because with how Infinity War ended, they could just not write him back in. And so it'll be funny to see what they do. And honestly, we already know that drafts and scripts go through a lot of rewrites. So even if they use James Gunn's script as the foundation, there's no way to tell how much of that will actually make it to the final product, no matter how much Bautista might want it. But to put another wrinkle into this, apparently there has been a lot of courting of James Gunn for various other movie studios and projects, including Marvel itself, who want to shuffle him either into a producer role on another project or for him to headline something in the tangential or tertiary field of the MCU, rather than, say, the cornerstone of whatever phase they go into next. It was really only Disney who had so much to lose because, like I said before, Disney has this whole media empire that is prevalent on family and all ages, and even their streaming service, even after they've already begun the steps toward acquiring Fox and Fox's movie catalog, they're not going to have any R-rated features in that streaming service, which is just a testament to how much they really put a stock into their family image. They had more to lose. They had a lot of public pressure. If he does something with another studio, my wish list would be Stray Bullets or Young Liars. I made these as jokes, but no, I really, really think he should. Because Young Liars, if you haven't read it, is perhaps the most whacked, just insanely vicious, but also really exciting, neon, and funny dark crime comedy comic. Just that tone and just that atmosphere. If it's nothing that has to do with franchises or superheroes, then I want to see something with a bit more of an edge to it. Moving on to more ludicrous movie news, we have the Oscars creating an entire new category just for the outright and blunt purpose of nominating a comic book movie. It's called Best Popular Movie. And everyone saw through this facade immediately because there was this huge outcry for Black Panther to be nominated for Best Picture. I think people are using it as their ammunition for saying, yes, it deserves Best Oscar, and it really doesn't. It's not that great. It's good, but it's not Best Picture. I think that it's pretty funny that we're now seeing this renewed indignation. I just can't believe that Black Panther is really the hill you're willing to die on in this. They're not really objecting at all to the best popular movie. It's just that Black Panther is going to be cheated out of its actual nomination and be put into this. It's ridiculous because it doesn't deserve a best picture, and we don't really need a best popular picture. It's just a lot of hooey. It's a nonsense category. And I know that we had the best animated movie created after Beauty and the Beast came out, and I think that almost won or did win Best Picture. So they made that just for this contingency, which I think it's backhanded slap against animation. Because even with that category, we don't see the wide scope of animation and animated movies in that category. So by best popular movie, it's still going to be a failed experiment, no matter how people might be taking it today. Overall, it's just this ludicrous move for a show that desperately wants ratings. Can you imagine Transformers 6 being nominated for an Oscar for best popular movie? Like, what is it going to be the criteria for that? Box office, reviews, Rotten Tomatoes? Is that going to be the new wave of the future for what gets fucking nominated for the Oscars? And you just know that just by that entire title of achievement in popular movies or popular film, this is going to lead to a whole rampant new era of shitposting around Oscar season, and it's going to be hilarious. Alright, let's wrap up with the movie news with a couple of quick shots. First, we have a new Supergirl movie has been announced, this time coming from the screenwriter of The Cloverfield Paradox. So there's a very small chance it's going to be any better than the actual TV show, which is probably one of the worst things on television right now. And Cloverfield Paradox was not a great movie. If it had been 100% better, it still would have been just an alright B movie. And that's with the intense amount of rewrites it actually got from the base first draft, which did make the rounds online. And it is way worse than the finished product. If you've seen the Cloverfield Paradox and you didn't like it or you thought it needed improvement, then just think about how bad that first draft was. I don't understand why they gave it to him, but I do understand why they're making a Supergirl movie, because why not? Just Supergirl. They're custom built around foundational characters, so honestly there's a lot they could do. The second announcement is that Chris Pratt's Cowboy Ninja Viking movie has been delayed. And if you don't know what that is, it was announced a few years ago, and it's based on his comic about this man who has been mind melded into being a triplet, which is a person with multiple personalities, and his personalities were the titular Cowboy Ninja and Viking. He has the skills and he can shift through these three personalities to fulfill whatever mission or whatever goal he has in mind, and he's being pursued by other triplets with other personalities. So I'm not surprised that that got delayed, and I'm just shocked overall that wasn't just quietly killed and shoved on the rug. On to TV news, we have the casting of Batwoman for both the Arrow crossover, introducing her, and the potential in development Batwoman TV series for the CW. And it is Ruby Rose as Batwoman. She'll first appear in the Arrowverse crossover sometime in the future. And that announcement had probably the most surprising reaction, because I can't believe that anyone who still watches the Arrowverse cares about the quality of those shows. But apparently a lot of people have taken a lot of offense to Ruby Rose because they don't think that she can act, and my first thought was, that's pretty much 99% of the entire cast of every single one of these fucking shows. The Arrowverse is founded on a show where the main character can't act, because in the end, she's just gonna be another actress in a show that's gonna be full of ham-fisted melodrama, forced goofiness, and just really awful writing, because you're just making an argument for quality against something that inherently has no quality. And in another bit of insanity, we have perhaps the most insane equivalency between a show and a property that has nothing to do with comics to actual comics. And that is that we have the plot synopsis for the 4th season of Fargo and Jack Kirby's New God saga, which is that in the 4th season, Chris Rock will be playing a mob leader who in the past traded his son for another mob leader's son in order to keep the peace. So many comic fans and so many comic sites just completely zeroed in on this being a New Gods adaptation, which I think could be cool, but that's not necessarily something that I think that they are actually even doing. The whole trading wards for peace is an old as hell tradition. It's older than dirt. It's not something that he created out of thin air. So the fact remains that just because it has a similar setup doesn't mean that it has anything at all to do with the actual comics, because you could have just come up with it the same way that Jack Kirby did. by drawing from things that people actually did, especially warring factions. Even Game of Thrones did it. It's a bit early to jump the gun like this because just that whole air switching for peace isn't really the focal point or the necessary meat of the New God saga. It's really Orion and Scott Free and just the entire setup and how they relate to each other. So if this show does come out and the season does start and the two wards are grown up and one of them is clearly Orion and one of them is clearly Scott Free and the two mob bosses are shades of Darkseid and Highfather, that would blow my fucking mind. It really would. But so far, just way too early to tell. And finally, with comic news, we have two announcements that just completely bore me to death with their cliche and numb bullshittery. The first of which is that Joshua Williamson is planning another Flash War, this time centering around Impulse, who returned to the DCU at the end of the first Flash War. In the most boring way possible, he just showed up, crashed on the page. It was just like, hey, I'm back. So that was anticlimactic and really lame. Flash War as a whole was just the most boring Flash arc for the most overhyped thing. I mean, Williamson hasn't written anything good with the Flash ever. He's just the most boring writer this side of Jurgens. Let's be honest here. But perhaps what really sticks in my craw is this next one, which is also a war. It's called Blood War. Apparently, Youngblood, like I thought and like I've speculated, has officially been cancelled. And that's not a surprise because I don't think anyone has ever been able to write a complete Youngblood run without somehow fucking it up. And I still maintain that the first arc is a really good young team arc. It really is. But the second arc is just a huge fucking mess that is so boring and has nothing going for it. And it just takes all these really horrible storytelling choices for no reason. But now you're getting Blood War, which led to the cancellation of 2 whole issues. And it's going to be co-opted just by this, I think, event mini drawn by Rob Liefeld, despite the fact that the whole relaunch of Youngblood was centered around the fact that you're getting, say, a new, sleeker and sexier Youngblood, something a bit more stylish, something a bit more, I don't want to say this in a bad way, Jamie McKelvey-ish. So to bring Liefeld back is possibly the biggest 180 that this series could have gotten, and hopefully it's its death knell because it's just not worth it anymore. I might be hard on the second arc, but there was still a way that this could have been salvaged, and now there's just no hope of that. They just fallen back into every pitfall that every Youngblood run eventually goes into, which is they just go back to Liefeld. It's a series that really needs to move past Liefeld, and it never will. And I've come to accept that it never will, and it'll never be worth reading. So rest in peace, all new Youngblood. Anyway, I think that's it for news. Let's get on into what I read this week, because there was a lot of great releases, and I just can't get to talk about them. First up is Sideways number 7, which is the first issue of the Seventh Soldiers arc that has been solicited and teased for quite a while. Now, this is a series that I was really excited about and that I was a really big booster of for the first couple of issues. Although I have to admit that number 5 and number 6, they weren't really that great. Number 5 had a lot of tonal issues and didn't really make use of the honestly rather fun power set of the character that the hero was going up against. So that was just an iffy issue. And number 6 was very rushed. It was a plot point that everyone could see coming from a mile away, and it was hinted at and stated at, but the actual execution of it just felt really early and could have been put off for a few more issues. This issue was definitely an uptick. First of all, it's the deal writing solo with Kenneth Rocafort, so there's no Justin Jordan on this issue, and in that sense it does lose a bit of consistency between the first couple issues, which I really did enjoy. But what really works about it is the aftermath and the consequences of the character death in number 6, because as I mentioned, the deal definitely prefers his heroes to suffer, and that would be, I say, a bad thing if he didn't know how to back it up, because you have something like OMAC and its final issue. Kevin Coe as OMAC has his life completely shattered, and just the writing of that with Keith Giffen sells that immensely, and the deal is able to bring the same chops to this issue, where you see Sideways really dealing with the trauma and the just sort of emotional turmoil that his mother's death has inflicted on him, and just all that regret and all that insane pathos is really played to the hilt, and it works magnificently. Getting Rocafort on the art again just ratchets up the emotional intensity like tenfold. There's one scene that honestly just hits you like a sucker punch. It is just so magnificently well handled. So on that basis alone, this issue reignited my passion for this series. Although one of the most optimistic things about it is how it's able to balance all of that with reintroducing the Seven Soldiers into post-Flashpoint continuity. Now, we haven't seen a fair few of these in a long time. I know that Bulleteer showed up as a cameo in one of the early issues of the Green Lanterns, and Charlotte Norman hasn't appeared at all. So we really do get a nice and honestly kind of charming reappraisal of them as a team and as characters. And it segues from the emotional pit that Derek is trapped in to this entirely new and outrageous setting quite capably. So the make or break of this arc is going to have to be whether or not it's able to handle the same emotional highs while still giving itself momentum and not feeling forced. And I hope it makes it past this arc and gets a bit more of the recognition that hopefully it will earn as more issues come out. And if it doesn't, then I'm completely fine with this being a 12-issue series. Although, if it does end up getting cut at 12 issues just for a nice meaty side deluxe trade of some wonderful art, then I hope number 12 is able to stick the landing and bring everything back full circle. Next, we have Red Hood and the Outlaws, number 25. And I was a bit wrong, actually. I had believed that the last issue, we had seen the last of Artemis and Bizarro, and that was meant to be the final farewell to the whole Outlaws team. And in that sense, I was actually pretty annoyed by the issue because I felt like it was such a really rushed and wonky way of writing out those plot threads in order to create a new editorially mandated status quo. This issue really showed me how full of errors that perception was, because this is the issue where you see all those plot threads really come full circle at, where you see all those plot threads really do get written out, and it's handled in such a much more loving and heartfelt way than number 24 was. So I have to give props to Lobdell, because there were so many ways that kowtowing to an editorial mandate could have gone wrong, and that was definitely one of the things that I thought number 24 was suffering from. And yet this one, it still suffers and it's still very rushed. In fact, this issue is extra sized, but there's still so many events and plot threads that Lobdell was setting up that he has to address and he has to put in storage for hopefully the nearby future where he can play with them again in order to make room for what the higher ups are demanding of him right now. That it definitely works. As events, they work. As an entire issue, it does feel like things are colliding against each other, but all the actual those scenes, they work wonderfully. Especially the way Bizarro and Artemis are written out. It's heartbreaking, honestly. And they're not written out in a way where they just shoot out. They're written out in the sense that Lobdell can come back to them at any time, whenever he gets the chance to. Even with the foreknowledge that they're going to be followed up on in the Red Hood and the Outlaws annual, that gives me hope that we haven't seen the last of them. And even if the annual does come with more finality to their situation and to their relationship with Jason Todd, it's at least done with a lot more care than I thought it had been. Lobdell's Bizarro has been just an utterly amazing and beautiful character. It's why I love Bizarro. It's why I've always loved Bizarro. He's just so fantastic. And Artemis and Jason Todd's whole dynamic definitely comes to a head here. It's got a dynamic that I love. Alright, it's the kind of dynamic that I'm a huge sucker for, so I'm just gonna be a complete shill for it either way, so that definitely gets my pass any day of the week. It's definitely a finale to the entire last 24 issues, to this entire chunk of the Outlaws era, but it feels a lot better a lot of the times you do see this happen again and again. That's great, and it's honestly something that will keep me around for this series for at least a little bit longer, and it does get me really, really hyped about where the series is going, even if we're going to like a more edgy Jason Todd that higher ups are demanding so they can gauge his spin-off potential. I have some faith in Lobdell, and that's not something I can say all the time, so fingers crossed. Now for some quick shots, because there's some things that I read that interested me but have honestly no depth of engagement with, even though I did like them. We have the new launching pad for the Vertigo Sandman universe, which is a vignette book with bookends by Simon Spurrier and Bilquis Evely, and their book called The Dreaming is definitely something that I'm going to read. Evely's art is fantastic and wonderful, and Spurrier, he can be hit or miss. More miss nowadays, even though I still really enjoy his work, and their whole approach to the characters and just the imaginative and somewhat wry universe they live in definitely hit tone with me. A lot of the other vignettes, they didn't really set my world on fire, but when they get their number ones, I'll check them out and see what's what. Dan Slott's first issue of Fantastic Four, it was cute. I mean, that's the most I can say about it. It was really cute and it was somewhat charming and funny. I love the Fantastic Four. I love their concept. I love a couple of the early issues and just the immense imagination that Jack Kirby put into a lot of the designs. And I think it's his and Stan Lee's strongest work together outside of Hulk, but it's not a series that has had a giant draw for me in a long time. It's cute, it's friendly, it's somewhat funny, and it's a bit of an adorable read. So as long as it keeps up that tone and as long as it keeps up that kind of quality and that atmosphere, I'll be sticking by it. I'm not going to say it's the greatest thing, but hell, I'm a sucker for The Thing and Alicia Masters. I've always have been, and I think that one of the best elements is one of my favorite love interest dynamics. So I'm in for it. I'm into it. And speaking of Fantastic Four, I know I was just talking about Dan Slott's first issue, but I wanted to do a little tangent here. Tom Scioli, who did that wonderful Superpowers backup for the Young Animal books, posted a pitch project he had been working on for Marvel, doing a sort of X-Men Grand Design-esque comic miniseries, but for the Fantastic Four, and I love it. It looks great, and I'll be devastated if we never get it, which we probably won't. I don't see there being much sense in posting up a pitch project if they're actually going to move forward with it, so that's probably dead in the wind. But I just love the pages he posted up, and I love the conceit where he definitely tries to bring themes of a sort of recurrence, which is always on my list. I love things that do seem to parallel or do seem to run across trends within a narrative. So that was lovely, and if it ever comes to fruition, that will be definitely something I am going to completely get on my list, no doubt. Last but not least, we have Scooby Apocalypse number 28, and that was a fine issue. It just moves ahead the plot a little bit more. I think that's the end of the backup. Secret Squirrel intimates that the next backup is going to be the last one, so whatever happens there, I'm pretty interested, because that backup has been not consistently funny, but overall it's been pretty fucking hilarious. This issue, it definitely pulls on some threads that have been really bluntly foreshadowed. Hopefully the next issue does do a lot more of them, because it's definitely falling into a really dragging spot, and this series has always worked better when always moving forward with the next sort of twist and turn. Anyway, that's it for what I read this week. Let's move on into the spoiler cast. First up, let's do Teen Titans Go to the Movies. Look below if you haven't seen this and you want to skip over it. Anyway, starting right now. And as I've said before, with Teen Titans Go, it's not a show that I am extremely in love with, but it has its place among all the other children's cartoons right now. It's the wacky, small, somewhat eclectic little show. A gag a minute, it's honestly kind of charming at times, and it definitely has a lot more hits to its name than a lot of people would admit. So going into the movie, I did have not high expectations, but I was expecting an overall good time, and honestly, that's what it is. It's not something that I would pay full price for. I caught it at a matinee with my nephew, but for that price, it definitely is one way to kill at least an hour and a half, an hour and 20 minutes. My only complaint would be that it definitely feels like just an extra long episode of the show. It doesn't feel thoroughly cinematic, which has its pros and its cons, because it definitely keeps to the spirit of the show a lot more like that. It's not something that has to take a giant change in direction to make it work for a movie and then it loses the charm or at least the appeal that it has for the show's fans. It keeps it consistent. Yeah, it does feel like it drags out in spots. There are some spots where it does have a really sublime joke, like where you have this entire musical interlude that is the mandatory uplifting, inspirational, motivational song, and they accidentally kill the person singing it. They just hit him with a car, and then they just book it to not get arrested for murder. And that's the kind of joke which I did not expect to see. And I know that the show itself definitely does get a little bit more analytical and a little bit more mature at times, but usually in a different way. There's an entire episode about how to invest properly and real estate tax law. So it definitely has more to it than the sort of very silly and goofy and random humor that a lot of people ascribe to it, though the movie is definitely chock full of it. And with movies like that, like say joke a minute random nonsense movies like Airplane and a lot of those parody and very widget movies, the key to the game is frequency. And with Teen Titans Go, the frequency definitely isn't there enough to make you forget about the times where it has a lot of dragging fleeting and slow moments. What that means is that while it does have a lot of jokes, it does take its time with each of these jokes to where you realize that it could have moved past a lot of these without losing any momentum. It's not like, say, like I said, Airplane or any of the Police Squad movies where you have maybe like 10 different jokes including visual gags within one scene that takes like 10 seconds. This definitely takes one joke and it does whatever it can with it for as long as it needs to, and it loses something there. So the end result of it is that we're left with a story and a movie that you could have cut maybe 30 minutes out of, and it still would have been a pretty decent extra long episode of the show. But what it does and what the story beats it does hit are ones that are definitely on my checklist, and it does have little heartening moments scattered throughout it. And that's really all you need. To get a little bit more into the separate character aspects of everything like that, I do think that this fleshes out the cast a bit more, because in the show they do seem more at odds and a lot less like friends, but this one really does try to sell them as a group that actually likes each other on a real day-to-day basis and that they have purpose and a bond together. Bringing in Slade, I don't think that he worked as well as they probably hoped, although I will say that I like Will Arnett's rendition a lot more than Ron Perlman's rendition of it. And I'll defend that, because Ron Perlman, no matter how well he voice acted the role, that version of Slade, that version of Deathstroke was kind of a nothing character. He was all talk, and he definitely had no real master plan. There was always the overarching goal of getting Robin to his side, but other than that, there was nothing consistent about each of the little elements he lined up every time he showed up that were part of his plan outside of what they cribbed from older and more iconic Teen Titans arcs, like the Judas Contract. While with Teen Titans Go and this version of Slade, it's tied a lot more and it is a lot more coherent, and I think Will Arnett definitely sells the exasperation. And like I mentioned with story beats that I'm a sucker for that are in this movie, I love the heroes trying to make their own villain and they accidentally get caught up with someone that is an actual threat. It never goes as far as I would like, because there are movies that definitely have that, and it definitely does have a lot more impact in those movies where they really do get into the shit. This tries to have that, but it pulls a lot of its punches and it doesn't really work to its own benefit. I think the closest it gets to is when the Teen Titans tower just explodes and Robin is at his lowest point, or during a mid-movie action break where he completely outclasses them in every single way imaginable, but it still lacks the weight. One thing I do have to give the movie, though, tries to combine in a kind of Captain Underpants sort of way different styles of animation, art styles, and mediums. So it definitely keeps itself interesting visually. I know a lot of people have problems with the art style of the show, and I think that they took that to heart and really tried to shake it up to get a lot of detractors on board. And it works. Each time it switches tack, it's for a built-in perspective or story purpose. And it's definitely appreciated, and it's definitely executed well every time they do it. Oh, and I would be remiss not to talk about the DC Superhero Girl short that precedes the movie. It's a fun little short, and I can't wait for that show to drop because Garen Beck of Legion, and yes, I'm saying that with all the dots, is going to be on it. So I can't wait to see what the hell they do with him. Overall estimation, I would have to put it at 7.5 out of 10. Alright, so if you use the time code, you should land right here. And right now I'm going to go into Deadpool 2 Super Duper Cut / Extended Edition spoilercast. So look again at the time code below if you don't want to be spoiled on whatever things I bring up that are solely about the extended edition. Here we go. Deadpool 2 extended edition is not good. It's honestly an inferior product in so many ways. Now, the original version, the theatrical version of Deadpool 2 is still my favorite Fox X movies. It's definitely something that I really enjoy, and the shades of it that still exist within the skeleton of the extended edition, they still work for me. But the extended edition takes that and it definitely drags it out and weakens a lot of the impact wherever it can. Now, it's not something like the Suicide Squad extended edition where it's only like 2 minutes longer and everything that's extended about it was just superfluous fluff. The Deadpool 2 extended edition, it adds stuff in that's actually plot and story relevant, but it's not something that we ever need to see. It's all set up for stuff that never needed setup. So you get stuff like the entire backstory of Russell's time, Fire Fist's time at the torturous orphanage. And it totally sucks the life out of the eventual reveal that the orphanage is insanely abusive toward mutant kids, because you already know it. So there's no like oh moment when Deadpool figures out, and there's no real capitulation of it. It's just dragging out and extending the lead for no reason, and you're just tired by the time it pops up. And not only that, it makes a bit of a plot fuzzle because while we do get that setup, it then cuts to a scene where it acts like that was months in the past, and it just doesn't work. It feels very jarring. So that's not something that was needed at all. And then you get other stuff like Deadpool having an extra montage trying to kill himself before the giant gasoline explosion in his apartment. It's not that funny, and it does lose the impact because it doesn't go from him wallowing in his misfortune to immediately just trying to kill himself. It just sort of elongates it, and you're not riding that emotional high anymore. And that's really the main problem. You're not riding the emotional high of this movie. The theatrical cut, it never loses that momentum of like the despair and of the reappraisal of Deadpool and Cable's various traumas. It still keeps in moving forward despite the movie going into some radical tangents and directions. This, it tries to explain too much, it tries to show too much, and you stop caring whenever that happens. So whatever there is loses weight, it loses dramatic resonance. On the other hand, though, where you get the alternate takes aspect of this movie, of this edition, some of them are pretty good. It's just not worth watching this edition for all this other stuff that bring it down and actually makes it lose points with me. It's not worth the high price of renting right now. It's not worth the high price of buying either physically or digitally. It just feels like, when is this going to end? And that's not really where you should be going with a movie. So if you use the time skip, you'll be landed on here. And I have to say that the extended edition is a lesser product. If you're a real completionist, then go ahead. But even though it has some humorous additions, overall it drags out the movie, and it definitely is at least 2 or 3 notches lower than my original score. So I have to say 6 or 5 out of 10. All right, thank you for that. Let's move on to everyone's favorite subject, listener questions. Now we have a couple today. First off, we have a couple from the ever amazing Medea, and their first question is, what are my thoughts on the Teen Titans property in general? Now, that's a really interesting question because while I agree with so many people that the Teen Titans property is insanely cursed and there has been a really good, proper Teen Titans comic in so long, I do enjoy the general idea of them, and I think that they're a very necessary part of the DCU, especially if there are so many sidekicks and legacy characters that can't be successors around, because that's their main conceit to begin with. You had Robin, you had Speedy, you had Wonder Girl, you had all these younger characters that were just filling up space, and they can't always be in the adventure with the main heroes. They need something else to do. They need something that can grab their interest, or otherwise they're just filling up space and wasting ink, more or less. Just giving them their own team, it makes a lot of sense, and I understand why they do it, and I understand why it keeps coming back. The flip side of that is I don't think the Teen Titans really work when it's just random teen heroes, watering down the concept. Teen Titans, I believe, or at least I maintain, is meant to be more about, and should be more about, the people who are the sidekicks. Beast Boy, he's not really a sidekick to anybody. He's just filling up space. Bunker's not a sidekick. I love Beast Boy and I love Bunker, but they shouldn't be on the Teen Titans. It just doesn't work because then you have to pivot the entire direction of the gimmick. And that never works out because then you have to make it more about them being teens than anything else, and that just is asking for a lot of trouble, and we've seen that again and again, how much that asks for trouble. And just to underline this point, my favorite incarnation of Teen Titans has to be Young Justice. And I know in the first issue of Young Justice, they make a point of saying, we're not the Teen Titans, but let's be honest, they're the Teen Titans, and they're going back to the initial reason for them to exist. The idea that we have so many of these teen, Justice League-oriented heroes, and we need a place to stash them. And Young Justice came about at the exact perfect time to make use of all these weird floating secondary and tertiary kid characters that were connected to Justice League mainstayers. You had Con-El, who came shooting out of Death Metal Superman. You have Impulse, who was a byproduct of a lot of Mark Waid's repetitious The Flash is Gone type stories for his Flash run, which both of those are enjoyable. And you have Tim Drake, who epitomized 90s Robin, who made his mark. And then you also have, in a certain sense, John Byrne's Wonder Girl, and it's probably like his most beloved and most delible imprint on the Wonder Woman mythos of all the things he tried to do. So you have all these little aspects and all these janky things that are just careening out in the universe without a place to go. And Young Justice really did a great job corralling them all around and giving them a nice base, a nice foundation with each other and within the greater DCU. Sure, it's very dated and it's very much sort of a response to the very radical and 90s-esque atmosphere for teens where it's all a lot of horniness and hormone driven, but it still works and it makes a lot of sense to have them all together, and they're able to balance off each other and their expectations within the greater DCU as young Justice Leaguers, which is why I think that a lot of the times the Teen Titans just are insanely aimless because there's nothing really holding them together other than the fact that they're young heroes. So that's my overall thoughts on the Teen Titans concept. I would definitely create a secondary teen team just for all of those random teen characters that DC has hanging around, because I think that's the only way to really keep this moving forward and to give it an actual sense of identity. Because a lot of writers, I feel, careen out of control because there's no guiding principle for the team. And for Medea's second question, it's what are my favorite all ages shows or comics? And I love this question. I'm going to start with comics because there are a few all ages comics that I read and that really influenced me as a kid, and I can't find them anymore, or I can't justify the cost of actually getting them again. But if anyone out there is interested or has nephews or any kind of young relatives that want to get into comics, then these are some that I really, really loved. First, off the top of my head, would be Amelia Rules by Jimmy Gownley. I first read it as a series of trades of my public library, and I'm pretty sure that's the most accessible way that anyone can get it. But the overall premise of this series is a new girl, think middle schoolers, moves into town with her divorced mother and her aunt and makes friends with this entire gaggle of kids her age with a wide spectrum of personalities, from a mute kid who wears pajamas all the time that kind of like a Rorschach test of emojis on his chest that change from panel to panel, a really bossy and shrill girl, think Lucy from Peanuts, and a sort of wannabe cool kid who has a crush on the aunt, all this other stuff. And like I mentioned Peanuts, and the comic definitely knows that it's ripping a lot of the same sort of beats and elements from that series, and so there are, or at least in the first trade, a couple of gags where the characters are drawn in the Peanuts style, and it's definitely understanding where it's coming from, where the roots for a very young middle school type kid-centered comic is going to be about or it's going to riff on. And it works. It's very fun and a very cute little comic. And the most impressionable thing too is that it doesn't shy away from hitting hard in some places, and while it does have a lot of very humorous and gag oriented plots, it does delve into the characters every so often, and when it does, it makes full use of that across the trades. And there's one trade, I think it's the last one I read, was Amelia coming to terms with one of her friends who has cancer, and she makes all this attempts to really make the most of their friendship. Before they even figure out whether or not she's gonna make it, she moves away for treatment. It ends on an incredibly heartfelt and touching coda where it skips ahead, I believe, and this is just hazy memories, but it skips ahead a few years on the line, and Amelia hasn't heard from this person in years, and she finally does again. She finally figures out that, yeah, she did beat cancer. She did. And it's touching, and it definitely hit me, and it's very, very amazing little series. Number 2 on my list would be Bone. I know that it was meant to be more of an indie comic, but Scholastic reprinted it in color and sold it to middle school kids, and it works. It works as an all-ages comic. It works as a very all-ages adventure comic about very goofy brothers, and even though it does land some more risque moments, it's definitely something that I think really does appeal to kids a lot because it's so funny and it's so cute looking, and it's honestly a very charming book. And the series, as released by Scholastic, I know there's some debate over whether or not the black and white or the color is more fitting for the series. The color editions and the Scholastic branch actually led to a little spin-off aimed specifically and intentionally for kids from the get-go. So it's a series that definitely continues to pull in and appeal to younger sets, and it's a very fun and thrilling book. So yeah, I think those would be probably my 2 favorite all ages, or at least all age marketed comics. As for shows, can I say Power Rangers? I'm going to say Power Rangers. At least when I was a kid and you had stuff like Lightspeed Rescue, which still holds up because I rewatched that with the Twitch stream, and a lot of the plots and a lot of the writing are still excellent, at least for a kids-oriented action show. So I know, and I follow a lot of people who are still into Power Rangers, and I glance at it from time to time. While it has been on a downturn, a lot of the seasons are still pretty damn good, and you can find almost all of them on Netflix. So a lot of the great moments, a lot of the great characters are still readily available, are still able to reach kids, and kids are able to experience that. So Power Rangers. I'm not going to get into exactly exactly which ones I enjoy, but off the top of my head, Lightspeed Rescue is great. Lost Galaxy was really fun, and the backstory and the behind the scenes stuff of that was insanely heartwarming, especially regarding the first Pink Ranger of that team. Plus, RPM is a little bit of a darker series, but it's still really fun and goofy. Plus, to also mention just something that I was really into that was also a Saban brand show, Big Bad Beetleborgs. That made a huge impression on me as a kid. Only when I revisited it out of pure curiosity, I realized that it was about comics. That's something that I never remembered. I remembered Flabber, the genie ghost, and his mummy and Dracula friends, but the whole comic thing totally slipped into my subconscious. So maybe that's an influence for why I like comics so much. I don't know, but I rewatched that, and while it's not a great show, it's definitely not bad. It's really goofy in a sort of Little Rascals sense, and has that quality of corniness and cheese to it for younger kids, like middle school kids. But those are my favorite, and I don't know, they're really, really fun. I guess if I'm watching anything now that is all ages, I'm just gonna say something like Kamen Rider or Super Sentai series. They do show a lot more damage and destruction and not so unimplied death, but they work and they're a lot more colorful, and the stakes, I think, are still very age appropriate. I would mention other things like cartoons, but that was a previous question from a previous episode, so I'm just going to mention Static Shock. Thank you, Medea, for both your questions. It was a great going down memory lane with both of these. And our second batch of questions comes from Eggmath. Thank you again. It's great having another question from you. And this question is quite a doozy. It is, what is my favorite period of Jack Kirby's works? As in, what years do I think he was putting out his best works and why? Now, this is a bit of a hard question because I've just been rediscovering my love for his and Stan Lee's original Hulk run, and I really want to give it to that. But this year has been quite illuminating for me because it's the first time I went back and really did delve into his Golden Age stuff like Challengers of the Unknown. And just the concept and just the imagination put into that rivals anything he did with Marvel. So it's kind of pulling me to pieces, and I would definitely be not doing them justice by forgetting about them and for going for an easy answer. So Challenge of the Unknown, his original series at DC, is amazing, and the Hulk run is still so good and still very gripping, even if it has Stan Lee's writing, but I think it's more elevated than, say, things that he did for Fantastic or for Spider-Man. So just going over his published works, the actual years, I would have to say would be the early to mid 70s. I know it's such a cliche answer at this point, but I have to give it to his DC work because you have the greatest concentration of straight hits. And I know that while a lot of these series did fumble out near the end of their runs, like Forever People and Mr. Miracle, there's still such a concentrated breadth of atmosphere and just deep, impactful messages that I had to give it to them. You have not only his Fourth World works, but you have OMAC and you have his Losers run and you have Commandy. Just amazing, stellar works. Now, his Losers run is something I want to give a little bit of spotlight to because while it does have very corny plots to them, like introducing a very unusual kind of femme fatale, it's still very daring for doing something like that. And even those issues that are very kind of silly, they do not shy away from the horrors of war. And there's one scene where you have soldiers lining up unarmed civilians and just gunning them down on a double page spread, and it's just the most horrifying thing. Definitely for Jack Kirby, like early 70s to mid 70s, like 71 to 77, just amazing stuff. And thank you for that, Amath. Any reason to extol the virtues of some of his stuff. It's incredible that Jack Kirby had so many defining series and creations in almost every decade of his career. You have Challengers of the Unknown, you have Hulk, the entire Avengers lineup as it is, the Losers, Commandy, Hunger Dogs, Mr. Miracle, all this stuff. And that's not even going into his later works like, say, Captain Victory, which never got a proper ending and hasn't had a proper reprinting, even though it deserves it because it's an amazing little space odyssey adventure saga. There's a reason he's called the king, and it's not just because Stan Lee created it to be funny. Like, that's the actual origin of that, but he definitely earned it 10 times over every single time he put pen to paper. And hopefully that answers your question, Eggmath, and hopefully I answered your question to satisfactory requirements too, Medea. Anyway, thank you all for listening. Thank you again for sending in questions. Thanks for anyone who sends in feedback, comments, and just tries and gives it the time of day, even if it's not your thing. It means so much to me, and just continuing to do this series has been and continues to be an incredible delight. As always, if you have your own questions or comments or topics you want to hear discussed on the show, please tweet at me at THE_SNICKMAN or comment below. As always, I want to give a grateful shout out to the cover artist at DOTEMCEE, and with yet another just grateful acknowledgement to all listeners everywhere. See you again next week.